So here's the deal. We are trying to look at people from the past and think, what would they be saying to us as we're heading out into our lives each day? And today we're going to be looking at Jacob. And Jacob is a really interesting guy. And maybe it's not going to be as much of a race today as a wrestling match. And so we're going to talk about Jacob wrestling with God here shortly. But I really just want to kind of start off, because when I was watching Jim teach this series, I kept thinking, I've been in those moments, a few moments, like way back in high school, where I was on the wrestling mat, and I'm wrestling some guy, and I hear all these screams and these voices telling me what to do, but I also knew some of those voices were telling the other guy how to beat me. And I think that's sometimes how it is in life. We have all these voices that are coming at us at all times, and they're just kind of bombarding us at all times. And some of them are for us, but there are some that are against us. And so I think sometimes we have to almost the very first thing we have to do is, which voices do we listen to? And be very specific to what voices we're hearing that are going on in our heads. And so I kind of want to as I thought into this whole series, I thought, that is so important. Because sometimes the people yelling at you to do things really want to see you fail. That's how this world works. It wants to see you fall. It wants to see you lose. And so we have to get clear minds and get a clear idea of who we're supposed to listen to. I didn't put this verse in the notes, but there's a passage where it talks about Jesus talking about, I call the sheep out of the gate, and the ones that know my voice will follow me. But the key is, do you know God's voice? Do you know his voice? And I think that's sometimes where we have a little bit of a breakdown. And so as we're doing this series and we're listening to these words from the people of the past, these great witnesses up in heaven, watching us live life, who are they listening to? And some of their lives, just like ours, they had the same kind of voices being thrown at them, where some of the voices were against them. Some of the voices were coming from within. Their sinful nature was basically telling them to do things that were against what God wanted. And that's what we're kind of running into with Jacob. Jacob was, from birth, he was known as there's several words they kind of throw it out there, trickster, deceiver, and it was started from birth. I mean, basically from birth. So basically, if those who were here last week, Jim talked about Abraham, his son Isaac, who he almost sacrificed on the thing, which I'd love to see that family reunion afterwards. We're now talking about Isaac's two sons, Esau and Jacob. And in that day, Jim kind of talked, your name meant a lot, and your name has a lot of meaning at that time. And so as these two were being born, they're twins, they're being born, Esau came out first, and he was called Esau, which basically means hairy. Now, I don't mean like Harry the name, I mean like hairy, like me, like this, like this. And so he's like, that was where he kind of got his name from, it's Harry. As he's coming out of the womb, there's a hand reaching out, holding onto his heel. Now, there's a thing for pro-life, isn't it? Right. That'd be a good image, wouldn't it? Yeah. We need that as the image for pro-life. This hand is reaching out, trying to pull Esau back in for the most part, because Jacob wanted to be first, because the firstborn got all the good stuff. The firstborn got the goods. They got twice the inheritance as all the others. And so he's basically, from birth, as he comes out, they basically name him Jacob, which in that time was kind of a slang almost for deceiver, heel grabber. How would it like to be named that from birth? Start life with that kind of connotation in your name. Just, that's just bad. That's a bad start. But that's how Jacob got his start. And unfortunately, Jacob lived up to his name often. See, he didn't get out of that womb first. So he goes, I'm going to get that first right. I'm going to get that birthright somehow. So what he did, later on, he tricks Esau out of his birthright. Esau comes in. He's hungry. He's been out hunting. Esau was like this big hunter, burly kind of guy. Jacob was a little bit more on the mama's boy type side, And so he's like, he basically goes, he tricks him, goes, hey, I got some good red stew, which sounds gross to me. But red stew, I don't know what that is. Tomato soup, maybe? I don't know. But he's offering him stew. And Esau's so silly, he trades in his birthright for a bowl of soup. Kind of silly on his part, but Jacob knew what he was doing. But that wasn't enough for Jacob. I'm just trying to set the scene so you know where we're going to start off today. Jacob, obviously, Esau wasn't too happy with that. A little bit later in life, Isaac, who we talked about, he's getting older, losing his eyesight. his own wife and his son Jacob basically trick him into blessing Jacob. And this blessing that was given was basically kind of setting a stage about who received the family's authority, who received the family's goods, who received everything else. And this wasn't just what they had. This was kind of like setting a stage for what was to come even. And they trick Isaac to bless Jacob. Esau now is completely left with nothing. Esau finds out about this. Esau says, I'm going to kill that kid. I'm going to kill my brother. I'm going to take him out. And we're going to see a very much of a pattern of what Jacob did a lot. He fled. He took off. Didn't deal with the situation, deceiver, all this stuff happened. He takes off and goes to his uncle's house, and the fun starts all over again. And we're going to see this common theme in Jacob's life, that when we have relationships and we're a deceiver and we're known for those kind of things, and you do those things, obviously your relationships get damaged and broken. So basically he goes right into his uncle's, and his uncle kind of plays a little trick on him and basically marries off this older daughter that Jacob didn't want, and says basically Jacob works for 7 years, and basically they trick him into marrying the older daughter, who he really wasn't that interested in. Comes back and he goes, hey, you tricked me. He goes, yeah, that's what's happened. You trick some other people, it happens to you sometimes, doesn't it? Comes right back at you. So basically Jacob then goes, I really want the younger daughter. The guy goes, well, give me another 7 years. That happens. During those 7 years, though, Jacob starts embezzling, you might say. That's what we call it today. He starts embezzling the flocks and the herds of his uncle, his now father-in-law, and basically gets found out. So what does Jacob have to do? Flee. He has to run away again. He starts running back to home. But here now, and this is where our story kind of really begins, is Jacob is stuck in this one moment of time where he is basically going back to where he came from, who's back home, Esau, who's really ticked off. He's kind of running from the father-in-law because he says he's not happy because he basically got all the stuff stolen. And so this is the moment where we kind of start our story. I had a similar story when I was younger. When I was like 16, I met a girl on spring break, and I thought it was a great idea. She lived in Manteno, Illinois, a short 3-hour drive. Now, this is going to be prehistoric days for some of you young people. We didn't have cell phones, and anything pretty much beyond your block was considered long distance, right? If you were out of your... So going to another state, I couldn't do that. Nobody paid for that. So we wrote these things called letters. And you would wait, and you'd send the letter. I know it's prehistoric. The Flintstones lived 3 doors down from us. And so we're waiting for this letter to come back. I really wanted to see her. So I cut school. I lied to my parents. I cut school. And I drove to Manteno, Illinois. And this was the days before there was no GPS. It was a big old map this big. And you didn't know really which was the best way. There's no Google saying, this is your fastest route. Take a detour. There was none of that. It was just a big map, and you hope for the best. You didn't know if those roads still existed even when you got there. So we basically take off. I go off, and I visit her one time. I come back. That trip went good. Nobody found out. Second time, I made a little bit more arrangements. I got my friend in on it. I said, hey, here's the deal. I'm going to tell my parents I'm staying the night at your house. If my parents happen to call to check on that, I will call you about 9:30 at night just to make sure that, everything's good. Well, I call at 9:30 and his mom picks up. She goes, your dad just called. I was like, oh no. Oh no. I'm in big trouble. And I had to do a 4-hour drive home, wondering what my fate was going to be. What my father was going to do to me. I'm just trying to give you a little bit more new term and feeling of that moment. Has anybody ever been caught by their parents completely red-handed? Just busted big? That was that moment. Jacob is in that moment right now as he faces what he's going to do. And so Jacob, it's not mentioned in the passage we're going to read about today, but he starts praying. I was praying that whole trip home. I was like, oh, God, please don't let my dad ground me for life. Don't let him take me out. And I get home, and I had to face the consequences. There was no running. It was like, or I take off to Florida or something. I don't know. Just drive right by Indy, keep going. It really wasn't an option. And so that was just the craziness of it. That is where Jacob's at. I was trying to create that tension of going home to dad and not knowing what's going to really happen. And that's where Jacob's at. So here, let's get started with our passage here. He goes this, says Genesis 32:24 says this. It says, this left Jacob all alone in the camp. Basically, Jacob had sent his family on ahead. Some people had gone out, and they realized that not only was Esau was coming with 400 of his men with him. So things just got ratcheted up a couple more notches. And so Jacob thinks, hey, I'm going to start sparing my family. And he starts sending them in different directions, trying to spare his family. And he goes, this left Jacob all alone in the camp. And a man came and wrestled him until dawn began to break. When the man saw that he could not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of socket. Now, I find this interesting because I really wrestled with this whole passage. Because I'm thinking, I got really caught up on this phrase where it says this. He goes, and the man came and wrestled him until dawn began. When the man saw that he could not win the match, this other man, they believe, was an angel or God himself. And I just really have been tormented for a week on this one little passage. What do you mean God couldn't win? What does that mean? What do you mean God can't win against Jacob? This seems so bizarre. And so I wrestled with this internally, trying to, how do I even teach and communicate this? And I came up with the only story I could really think of, and I'm going to pick on one of my best friend's kids, and he's in the room, so he can beat me up later. I asked for permission to share this. So when Seth Owen was a young man, I mean really little, Seth had 2 gears. One was sleeping. The others will say energetic. Chaos might have been a better word, but energetic, we'll use energetic. If popping the heads off Barbie dolls when he came to your house, my daughter's Barbie dolls, heads popped off, arms off, that was just, Seth just had lots of energy. And Seth, basically, once you got Seth kind of going a little bit, Seth, at that point in his life, just his parents did a great job kind of helping him through this, he did not know how to turn it off. And Seth would be that kid that you would see kind of like your picture, you're holding their head and they're swinging at you. You're just kind of like this, please don't hurt me, because he would do whatever he could to get you down. And that was Seth, just this nonstop. And that's really what I think is happening here in this moment with this Jacob wrestling with God, is it's one of these matches where God's just kind of like going this with Jacob, and he's wrestling, and he is not stopping. He is not giving up. He is not willing to just admit defeat, and he just goes. And what would normally happen with Seth is his mom and dad would step in, and Seth would actually get in trouble. So I'd get him riled up, and Seth would get in trouble. It was a perfect thing. He's going to kick over my cane someday. I know that. He's like, yeah, see, I get you back for what you did to me when I was younger. So basically, God goes, hip, gone. And that is basically very painful. Could you imagine your hip just being popped out of socket? That'll slow you down, won't it? That'll humble you up pretty fast. And that's what's happened. I remember wrestling a kid one time when I was in high school, or middle school actually, and I was doing this move, and you kind of take their arm, and it's called an arm bar, and I'm going around, and this kid would not quit. He would not give up. I mean, I'm turning his little butt over, I'm thinking, and he would not stop. And then I hear a snap. And I hear this scream beyond belief as I dislocated the kid's shoulder. And it was interesting. Guess who won the match? I did. But he would not give up. Mentally, I got to think that kid really won the match. He was willing to have his arm dislocated before he gave up and turned over. That's tough. But I won. So in this moment, I kind of see these kind of images of what's kind of happening as God is basically saying, you can keep on fighting, but in the end, I'm going to win. I'm going to take you down. I'm going to win this. And so one of the things I just want to say, I always tell the guys in the back, don't even worry about my notes, the slides. So here's the thing. See if you have this one on there anywhere. Do you have any slides at all? I don't know if I turn anything in. It says this, choose to humble yourself before God does it for you. It is a lot less painful. Choose to humble yourself before God does it for you. It's a lot less painful. We fight, and I'm sure God sits and goes, how childish of you to continually fight for what you want, fight for what you think things are, and to fight for what you think is important when I know what's important. And I can take you down. I can put you on the mat. So that's my first way of looking at this passage. And I'm going to tell you, I got a couple different ways of looking at this passage. It's this moment where we fight against God, and God goes, just quit. Just calm down. Change. Humble yourself, because I can make this smooth and easy. They call that wisdom in the biblical Bible. If you can gain wisdom and do things and make decisions before you have to go through the pain, that's wisdom. Lots of the rest of us, we got another word, and it was usually called foolish. I have to go through that. I saw him go through it, but I think I can do better. And we end up on our backs on the mat. Broken hip and all. So basically, the first thing I think that Jacob would yell out to us is, choose to humble yourself before God does it for you. It's a lot less painful. The other side I feel going on here is also this, and this is kind of my other take, and I'm just basically, this moment is really where I just really got caught up in this passage. The other I just want to share about my own personal life, because it was a moment where I found myself in what I think was almost really happening here. So in 1999, before I was married, most of you who know me now, you've known me a long time, this is before I even knew you. This is back when I was working at another church before the church that some of you guys know me from. I was a youth pastor, and I was successful. No other way of putting it. We had a church, we had a youth ministry, about 300 kids a week. I was doing tours and talking at these conferences about sexual purity, about being, turning your life around. And also I was talking to thousands of kids at these conferences and stuff like that. I was at a church, I had a good budget, I had a good paycheck, everything was going perfect. And I went on a mission trip to Honduras with a men's group. And on the way back, I ran into this little flight attendant who said, "Hey, you're cute." And I said, "You're really cute." And that's usually how it starts. This flight attendant, she got free flights, so she flew up and see me one time, and we had a good time hanging out. She flew up a second time to come see me, and things got a little too good. Basically, that night, I had an intimate relationship with her that night, trying to keep the kids here clean. I had a relationship with her that night. And here I am. I'm a pastor leading people in a position of what most people would say, good integrity. All this stuff was like glowing. But in this moment of Satan knew my weaknesses from my past. And he got me good. I walked right into the party. And I had a one-night stand with this lady. Next day, I kind of knew this was not who I was. I sent her home. And I thought, like most of us, when we do something stupid and sinful, we think, I got away with it. Whew. I messed up. Only God knows. I can just act like it never happened. 3 months later, I get called into our church office. And within about 30 minutes, I was fired. The reason I share this story is that I found myself, much like Jacob, wrestling with God that night. Mine was under my pool table, so 29-year-old man under his pool table, crying, screaming out to God, going, what do I do now? My integrity shot, my witness is shot, all this stuff is gone, just blown away. And it's also a choice time. Hey, if I was going to be a sinner now, now's a good time to do it. Everybody thinks I'm one anyway. I might as well take off and do a bunch of other bad stuff, right? Anybody been in that position? Well, I'm already down. I might as well go do a bunch of other dumb stuff. We've all been there. It's a moment where you're crying out because you really have nothing left but God. My friendships were gone. I was basically, when I got exited, they said, don't contact anybody from the church. So it's a common exit plan nowadays. It's kind of brutal. All this stuff took place. And so I found myself on the outside, dark, lonely spot, much like Jacob, screaming out to God and wrestling. Is all this stuff I thought about in the past and I talked about and I said, was any of it true? Was any of it real? Did I mean any of that stuff? Because now is showtime. I got to leave my house tomorrow or I got to finish it here. And some of you have had suicidal thoughts. And these are thoughts, places you've been. Do I really want to face tomorrow? Do I want to step outside this house again? And so it's a wrestling moment with God. And I had to think through, what do I believe? And in that moment, in that time of just desperation, God was more real to me than the 10, 20 years I had before that. So So this is where we're at with Jacob wrestling with God. And God has an answer for us. And listen to what happens. Basically goes on. Let's see here, where are we at? He goes, what is your name? The man asked. This is God. The man basically asks Jacob. This is Genesis 32:27. It says this. What is your name? The man asked. He replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you'll be called Israel, because you have fought with God and men and have won. Now, did he win the battle? Did he go, I beat God? No, it's that he had understood finally his place. He had won an understanding of who he was and who God was at that moment. That night under the pool table, bawling my eyes out, I had became much clearer to me who God was and that he was a loving and forgiving God. In that moment, I had a much better understanding that I had become prideful and dependent on myself. I thought I was the best youth pastor on the planet. God knew differently. God loved me enough to deal with just me. Did it cause great damage to the church when I took my fall? Yes. That youth ministry went from 300 to about 30 in a couple weeks. That's on me. But God found it to be more important to deal with me personally than worrying about all the other stuff. He loved me enough to let me know that night that I'm going to walk out of here because I'm forgiven. It takes an understanding of knowing where you are and where God is, and that God is, he had had that wrestling match thousands of times before I got there. He had wrestled with people dealing with the same situation. He was an experienced wrestler. There's nothing you have done or said or think about that God hasn't dealt with yet. He's wrestled with others, and he wins. That is how Jacob won. He won understanding of his place in the world with men. He now understood his place, and then had won in the understanding of knowing who God was, and that God loved him right where he was at. God wasn't going to leave him, but God loved him. He gave him a new name, and that's probably another thing I think Jacob would cry out to us. He basically would cry out to us. He'd say, live out your new identity. Because that was a decision I had to make that night under the pool table. When I wake up and I go out into the crowd, how am I going to live my life? God, I'm just forgiven. I'm a child of God. I've been forgiven. All these things. I'm an heir of God's. I'm going to inherit what God has given for me in heaven. I've been given, basically you might say, a crown. And do I live out like I am a child of God or not? So the next day, I basically have to leave and walk out of the house and face the music. I'm walking through public, and I was kind of well-known at the time, and so I'd run into people. And I could tell them, maybe they didn't even know who I was, maybe they didn't care. But in my mind, they were talking about me. And unfortunately, when you're a youth pastor and you get fired, people already almost assume the worst. And so I had to deal with that part of it too. I share this story not to bring pity to me, but to talk about that night of crying. Have you been there? Have you? Have you had that night of complete desperation where you cried out to God, waiting for a miracle? Have you cried out? If you have, you understand Jacob. Jacob is yelling to you now saying, live out the new identity I've given you. Matter of fact, let me read this passage. It's rather long, but it's so good. It's written in the Message, so it usually takes a little longer. And I even cut out some parts of it because this is going to be good. So listen to this part. He goes, your old life is dead. Your new life, which is your real life. Matter of fact, that's right. When I started a church, it's called Real Life. This is where it came from. Your new life, which is your real life, even though invisible to spectators, is with Christ in God. He is your life. When Christ, your real life, remember, shows up again on this earth, you will show up too, the real you, the glorious you. Now, whenever you see kind of glory in the Bible, I learned a long time ago, this guy said, whenever you see glory, just think of it as this. It's the revelation of God's character and likeness. When you glorify God, you're basically revealing God's character and likeness to someone else. So when if I have a glorious body, my body is like Christ, and I'm revealing who God is to other people. And that's how I'm called to live my life. It goes on, it says, and that means killing off everything connected with that way of death. Sexual promiscuity, impurity, lust, doing whatever you feel like it, and grabbing whatever attracts your fancy. That's a life shaped by, listen to this, that's a life shaped by things and feelings instead of God. It's emotional. Your new identity is beyond emotional. It's beyond stuff. It's the real thing. Goes on and says this, you're done with that old life. It's like a filthy set of ill-fitting clothes you've stripped off and put in the fire. Now, you're dressed in a new wardrobe. Every item on your new way of life is custom made by the Creator with His label on it, and the old fashions are now obsolete. When you have a moment with God, and when you ask Jesus into your life at some point in time, you got a new self. You got a new identity. You got new clothing that actually fit you best. Some of us that have been around for a while, like me, and being in ministry, here I was a pastor, looked the part, but inside, obviously, there were some things that I wasn't doing so well. There were some things I'd got off track on. And you can choose now with wisdom to say, hey, I need to start getting some things back in line and in order. I need to be open and honest, or I'm going to find myself under the pool table or wrestling with God, and it doesn't normally end well. I'm sorry, it ends well, but it's usually a painful process to get there. And the thing what Jacob would also say is that blessing is here and now. It's not later. Matter of fact, the Bible says this in the Genesis, the passage with Jacob goes on. It says, "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. He goes, "Why?" This is the man, God. Why do you want to know my name?" The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob here. It was there, right then in that moment. He was blessed. It's not later. It's not, I'll get my stuff together some other time. There's a blessing waiting for you right now if you're willing to step forward. If you're willing to humble yourself before God. And you think, well, how do I humble myself? And I tell you, this is probably adds into my last thing here, is this. Don't be afraid to tell your story. Tell the story of where you got your limp. See, Jacob forever went on and had this limp caused by his hip being broken out of socket. The Bible talks about he had that limp throughout the rest of you read in his Bible and his story. And as I look at Jacob, I think, here Jacob, good and bad, is laid out for us to read. Thousands of years later, we're reading about Jacob, how he was kind of a conniving scammer, had this God moment, and the things that changed as he went forward. It's really the story of us. And we can't not be afraid of tell the story of where you got your limp. Where did you make that change? What was it that disrupted your world and you had to wrestle with God to move forward? And you came out victorious, not because you beat God, but because you finally got the understanding of who God was and your place in the world and your place with mankind. Your job is now to share this story with other people. Every one of you have it. It might have been 50 years ago. Mine was now 20-some years ago, 30 years almost. But it's my story. It doesn't own me, but it's part of my story. And I actually value that part of my time. It's the first time I ever shared that story in front of such a large group of people. And it's a risk. Some of you think, geez, why do we let him lead our youth? You know? And it's understandable. But if we look back to biblical times and these stories, these witnesses that we're talking about, almost every one of them had a story where they got a limp. Yep. And sometimes we hide. I think some of us, we overshare on Facebook and we undershare our story with the people who matter. Yep. And so it's a call for each one of us to kind of just break down that thing. You guys go to small groups. Are you really sharing about the real stuff? When you sit with your family, are you really talking about the things that really matter? When you're going through some rough stuff, do you ever share it with somebody? Because see, here's how it's supposed to work. These stories in the Bible, these witnesses, these voices that are supposed to be calling out are supposed to be an encouragement to us. And we are normally more encouraged when we see somebody who's gone through it before us. But if all of us are silent about our stories, no one has a clue. They think they're alone in a dark field by themselves. It's not until all of us start sharing our stories about, yes, man, did I bottom out. There's people in this room I know that struggle with alcohol. People in this room that struggle with sexual identity stuff. People that struggle with sex in general. There's people in here that struggle with thought life, of being depression and stuff like that. We all have our stories. If we could get to the point where we could openly and honestly share, even with non-believers, you know what's going to connect with a non-believer more than you telling, come to my church? You know what's going to connect more? Hey, man, I know your family's struggling. There's this one time in my life, and you share about your wrestling match with God. That will create a connection. That will lead to change. That's how it's supposed to work. So I just kind of close out. I just want to kind of share with you just the thought life of how this thing ends with Jacob. Jacob has this huge moment where he's just devastated. Jacob wakes up the next day and heads in, and he's basically ready now. Because he's had this moment, he's ready now to face the consequences. He doesn't know what Esau's going to do. Esau might just walk up, slash him in half, and be done with him. Doesn't know. But when we have an identity in Christ, and we know that, and we have this new understanding that we had that comes out of the wrestling match, we have a fulfillment within us that it doesn't matter, because we're not based on feelings now and things, we're now based on who Christ made us to be. I have the confidence to face things. I no longer have to run from things. And as Jacob goes out to meet his brother, the brother who he thought was going to kill him, who brought 400 men probably to take him out and his family. It's almost a moment of embrace. Not only had God been working with Jacob, Esau as well. He had forgiven him. He had moved on. He had done his own life. And that's kind of this last thing. Sometimes, many of us, we've been hurt by other people. Esau could have spent the next 20-some years, this is like 20+ year gap between when he left and when he comes back. Esau could have spent the last 20 years living in bitterness. But even Esau said, it's done, you're my brother. That is how we have to live our life. One, knowing who we are, wrestling with God, and don't stop wrestling until you get the answers you need. Keep wrestling. It's not okay to say, I'm doing really good in all these areas. I'm not even going to worry about that one anymore. I tried the wrestling God on that one, and we just couldn't come to an agreement. That is not where you want to end up. It's full wrestling till you basically end up humbled. And the second thing is, if you're the Esau type person, it's time to let it go. He wasn't bringing his 400 men to kill him. He was actually bringing his 400 men to greet him and help him carry his flocks and stuff back. It wasn't about things. It's about the wrestling match itself.